Picture the scene. You're standing at the edge of a village square just after dawn. A thin mist clings to the cobblestones. The air smells of damp wood, smoke from last night's fires, and something faintly metallic that you cannot quite name. A crowd is gathered, but no one is speaking. Mothers hold their children a little closer. Old men stare at their boots. A priest murmurs quiet words that no one can hear. In the center of the square, a wooden platform has been built overnight. It is rough, hastily nailed together, still weeping sap in places. Above it, a great wool leans against a post. Beside it, a coil of new rope. Beside that, a bundle of dry kindling stacked with strange care, as if someone had arranged it with love. You notice the sound then. Not the sound of the crowd. The sound of a cart, wooden wheels grinding over stone, coming closer. And you realize, with a slow, cold dread, that everyone in the square is waiting for the same thing. Not for justice. Not for spectacle. For a reminder. A reminder engraved in the flesh of one human being so that 1,000 others will remember what happens when order is broken. This was public death in the medieval world. Not the quick, clean end we imagine, but a carefully staged performance of pain. And what you are about to learn about how people actually died in this era will overturn much of what you think you know. Let's uncover the dark truth. Before we descend into the specific ways a body could be broken, you have to understand something strange about the medieval mind. Death itself was not the point. We tend to think of executions as punishments designed to kill. But in the medieval and early modern world, killing was often the easy part. Any sword could do that in a heartbeat. What the courts, the churches, and the crowds actually wanted was something far more layered. A message. A ritual. A warning carved into a single body so vividly that every witness carried it home in their nightmares for years. That is why the worst deaths were slow. Deliberately, methodically slow. The pain was not a side effect of the punishment. The pain was the punishment. And the audience was not incidental. The audience was the audience of the entire message. Think about that for a moment. In your world, a courtroom sentence is read quietly, and the accused disappears into a system most people never see. In their world, the sentence was the show. The square was the courtroom stage. The condemned was both defendant and script. Every scream, every collapse, every whispered final prayer became part of the town's shared memory. This is the first truth to fix in your mind. When we talk about the most painful ways to die centuries ago, we are not describing acts of chaos. We are describing acts of law. Rehearsed. Scheduled. Approved by men in fine clothes who signed their names in careful ink and then went home to have supper with their children. Cruelty on this scale was not a failure of civilization. It was one of civilization's tools. And that, more than any single method that follows, is the darkest fact of all. Return to that great wool leaning against the post. It is one of the oldest images of medieval punishment, and also one of the most misunderstood. In films, the wheel is often shown as a device someone is tied to and spun in circles. The reality was far worse. The wheel was not what broke you. The wheel was where they displayed you after you were broken. Picture the condemned laid flat on the ground, limbs stretched wide across a wooden frame set into the earth. A heavy iron bar, or sometimes the wheel itself swung by its rim, is brought down on the arms and legs, one bone at a time. The executioner was a trained specialist. He knew exactly where to strike. He knew how to shatter without killing. And in the worst sentences, he was ordered to work slowly, starting from the feet and moving upward, so that hours could pass before the blows reached the chest. Only then, once every long bone had been methodically broken, was the ruined body threaded through the spokes of the wheel like limp cloth, and the wheel hoisted upright on its post for the public to see. Here is the detail that makes the mind recoil. Some victims lived on the wheel for days, exposed to sun, rain, and birds, still breathing, still capable of weeping, unable to move or die. Passers-by were forbidden to help them. Water was denied. The point was endurance, not extinction. The wheel was the medieval mind's answer to a question we no longer ask aloud. How long can a human being remain a human being before pain empties them of everything they were. A society that could pose that question in public and answer it with wood and iron was a society that had made cruelty into craft. Now, shift your eyes to the bundle of kindling by the platform. Burning at the stake is perhaps the single most famous image of medieval death. Yet almost everything you have absorbed about it from films is subtly, disturbingly wrong. The Hollywood version shows a screaming victim engulfed in bright orange flames within seconds, dying quickly in a blaze of drama. The historical reality was often the opposite. If the wood was dry and stacked high around the body, the condemned could indeed die relatively quickly, often not from burning at all, but from smoke inhalation and heat suffocation before the flames ever reached the skin. In some regions, that was considered a mercy, and executioners occasionally added green wood or damp straw to reduce the initial smoke and prolong the death, or, in cases of ordered mercy, added dry tinder to hasten it. But when a court wanted the death to be a spectacle of suffering, the pyre was built differently. The fire was smaller, slower. The condemned was placed higher above the flames, so the heat rose gradually, blistering the skin long before it consumed the body. In such cases, witnesses reported deaths that took the better part of an hour. Here is the paradox that historians point to when describing this punishment. Fire was reserved above, all for crimes considered spiritual. Heresy, witchcraft, certain forms of religious dissent. The theology behind it was that fire purified the soul even as it destroyed the body, offering the condemned one last, agonizing chance at salvation. That is the darkest twist of the burning. It was not always framed as revenge. It was often framed as help. A cruel help, unwanted and unbearable, but help all the same in the eyes of the men who lit the match. And a society that can convince itself that setting a human being on fire is an act of care is a society that has taught itself a very particular lie. Now imagine a punishment reserved for the crime a medieval king feared above all others. Treason. The betrayal of the crown, the state, the sacred order of the realm. For this, ordinary hanging was not enough. The courts of certain regions, most infamously in medieval England, invented something layered, ritualized, and almost operatic in its cruelty. The condemned was first dragged through the streets, tied to a wooden frame pulled by a horse, so that the entire city could see him arriving at his death covered in mud and filth. He was then hanged, but only briefly, deliberately cut down while still alive and conscious. What followed was designed to strip him of everything a man could be, in a specific and terrible order. He was disemboweled while breathing. His organs were burned in front of him. Only then, when nothing remained of the person except a mind trapped in a ruined body, was he beheaded and the body divided into 4 parts. Those 4 quarters were carried to different corners of the kingdom and displayed on the gates of major cities. The message was engineered with chilling precision. A traitor did not simply die. He was unmade. His body could not even be buried in one piece. His name could not be spoken beside the graves of his ancestors. In an age when almost everyone believed the soul required an intact body for the resurrection of the dead, this was a punishment intended to reach beyond this world and into the next. Think of what that reveals about the medieval imagination. The worst thing a state could do to you was not to end your life. It was to erase your afterlife, to follow you across the border of death itself and continue the sentence there. Few images capture more sharply the strange marriage of religion and violence that defined the age. The soul was real, and that was precisely why the body could be so ruthlessly destroyed. Now step back from the platform and look around the square. You have been focused on the executioner, on the wheel, on the flames. But the truth is that most painful medieval deaths never took place in public at all. They happened in cells. Picture a stone room the size of a small closet. No window. No light except what leaks under the heavy door. A stone bench. A bucket. And a body curled on the bench, thinning by the week. In many medieval and early modern prisons, formal execution was not the only outcome for the condemned. Sometimes the sentence was simpler and quieter. Imprisonment without adequate food. Imprisonment in irons. Imprisonment in cells too low to stand in and too narrow to lie in. Starvation was a common, if unofficial, tool. So was thirst, which killed faster and more painfully than hunger. So was cold, which crept into damp stone rooms during long winters and simply refused to leave, taking the very old, the very young, and the very injured first. These were the deaths that never entered the chronicles. No crowd gathered. No priest read the sentence. Sometimes the family was never even informed. A person walked into the fortress, and years later, someone quietly noted that they no longer needed to be fed. Here is the harder truth. The most painful deaths of the medieval world were rarely the theatrical ones. They were the invisible ones, the forgotten prisoners, the starving debtors, the plague victims sealed inside boarded homes and left to die together in the dark. Public executions gave the age its terrifying reputation. But behind every wheel and pyre, there were dozens of quieter deaths, unwitnessed and unrecorded, that dragged on for weeks or months. Suffering, then as now, was mostly private. And private suffering rarely makes it into the history books, no matter how loudly it once cried out. Picture waking up one morning with a strange stiffness in your neck. By midday, you cannot swallow. By evening, the muscles of your jaw lock closed. Within days, spasms wrench your entire body backward until your spine bends like a drawn bow. This was tetanus, a common companion of any deep wound in an age without antibiotics. It killed slowly, painfully, and with the mind of the victim fully awake to the end. Or picture the swellings of the great plagues, hot and hard beneath the skin, growing to the size of eggs in the neck, armpits, and groin. Picture the black patches that gave the Black Death its name, spreading across the fingers and toes as tissue died on the living body. Picture the fevers that turned entire villages into silent, sweating rooms of the dying. Picture, too, the slow horrors that we now barely name. Gangrene creeping up a farmer's leg after a small cut from a rusted tool. Ergot poisoning from tainted rye, which set survivors on fire from the inside, convulsing, hallucinating, sometimes losing entire limbs to blackened rot. Childbirth complications that took days to kill a mother, with the whole household forced to listen. Here is the truth that so much romanticized history quietly hides. For most people in the medieval world, the most painful way to die had no executioner and no crime attached. It was simply the ordinary end of an ordinary life, in an age when medicine could soothe but rarely save. The wheel and the pyre were rare. Infection was everywhere. And that is the quieter horror history rarely dresses in dramatic robes. So how did it end? How did societies that once broke bodies on wheels and burned dissenters in market squares slowly, unevenly, become societies that hide their executions behind walls and prefer their punishments to be invisible? Not through a single revelation, not through one hero. Through centuries of arguments, mostly quiet ones, mostly 1 inch by inch. Thinkers began to ask uncomfortable questions. If pain does not prevent crime as effectively as we assumed, then why do we inflict so much of it? If a public execution merely entertains the mob rather than reforming it, then what exactly is the purpose of the spectacle? If a confession is drawn from a body being broken, can that confession be trusted to reflect reality? By the later centuries, more and more of these punishments were softened, restricted, and finally abolished across much of Europe. The wheel was retired. The stake was extinguished. The gallows were moved from public squares into hidden yards. But do not mistake this for a story of pure moral progress. The cruelty did not disappear. It relocated. It moved from open squares into closed institutions. It changed its costume. It learned to speak in bureaucratic language. In many cases, the number of people harmed by state violence did not decrease at all. It simply became easier for the average citizen to ignore. The medieval age wore its cruelty on the outside, in wheels and pyres and mangled bodies displayed on city gates. The modern age often wears its cruelty on the inside, in rooms most of us will never enter. Which is worse is a question thoughtful people still argue about. But the question itself is worth carrying with you long after this video ends. Step out of the square. Walk back through the mist, back up the road, back into your own century. And ask yourself the question that any honest journey into the past demands. Why did any of this matter? Why should the specific ways human beings died centuries ago concern anyone alive today? Because the same instincts that built those wheels and lit those fires still live inside us. The instinct to punish visibly so that others will be afraid. The instinct to translate our anger into rituals and call those rituals justice. The instinct to look at another human being and decide, quietly, that they no longer belong inside the circle of people who deserve mercy. Those instincts are not medieval. They are human. The medieval world simply gave them permission to speak louder and to hold hammers. Here is the deepest lesson these terrible deaths still whisper across the centuries. A society is not measured by how firmly it punishes its worst offenders. It is measured by how carefully it restrains itself when it has the power to do anything it wants to them. Every wheel, every pyre, every quartered body in the medieval square was proof of a society that had not yet learned that restraint. In every quiet courtroom, every locked-away sentence, every debate about the ethics of punishment in the modern world is proof of a society still learning it, imperfectly, incompletely, and often too slowly. Pain has always been the easy tool. It costs almost nothing to inflict. It requires no wisdom. What is expensive, what is truly civilized, is the discipline to set that tool down when it lies ready in your hand. That is the inheritance the medieval dead leave us. Not a warning about how brutal they were. A warning about how brutal any age can be whenever it forgets to keep asking whether its cruelty is truly necessary. So let us gather what we have uncovered. The most painful ways to die in the medieval world were not accidents of a savage age. They were designed, rehearsed, signed into law. The will broke bodies slowly on purpose. The stake burned souls slowly on purpose. The quartering of traitors reached beyond death on purpose. And beneath all of it, quieter and vaster than any spectacle, lay the invisible deaths of forgotten prisoners, plague-stricken villages, and untreated wounds that killed more people than every executioner combined. The lesson here is twofold. First, be careful of any history that turns cruelty into entertainment, because behind every dramatic image lies a real human being whose final hours deserve more than a shudder. Second, remember that the machinery of pain is never truly locked away. It waits, in every century, for a society willing to reopen it in the name of order, faith, or fear. If this journey into the darker corners of history has changed the way you see the past, do not let it end here. Subscribe to Medieval Secrets Unlocked. Ring the bell so you never miss what we uncover next, and explore our other investigations that walk into the shadows of history and come back with the truth. And before you go, tell me this in the comments. Of all the deaths we have explored, which one disturbed you most, and which one had you never even heard of until today? Your answers shape the stories we tell next. Because in the end, the truth about the past is often stranger than the myth. A brief closing word. This video is offered as historical education, an honest reckoning with practices that shaped centuries of human life. The suffering endured by the people behind these stories was real,